Hello, everyone. We are here today with episode 45. Alisa couldn't make it, unfortunately, so I'll just be winging it by myself. We have Colman Noctor with us here today. Thank you for joining us. Colman is a child and adolescent psychotherapist based in Ireland. Colman, please, a few words about what you do and how did you get to this stage in
Yeah,
your life?
I suppose I obviously began my career actually as a mental health nurse when I left school, and then um, so I've been working with children and families now for about 25 years, and then more recently into young adults, so 18 to 25, um, and yeah, I also work in a university. I'm a lecturer in Southeast Technical University, so. Um, it's a very varied role. I have my therapeutic and clinical work, and then I have my teaching, and then I do some media as well. But I suppose my interest in technology and the impact of technology on child development, and I suppose the emotional lives of teenagers specifically, um, began in around 2010, 2011. It was actually a personal experience when my son was born. I kind of shared on it was only Facebook and kind of YouTube was all that was around back then. And I remember sharing a picture of him, and over the next few days becoming kind of consumed by the likes and the things that were coming through. And then after a few days, it kind of settled down, and I kind of thought, then who didn't like my picture? I became almost more interested in the people who didn't like it than the people who did. And I kind of got consumed by it a little bit. And I remember thinking to myself, like, at the time, I was a man in his late 30s. I'd been through years of personal therapy. I was well psychologically adjusted. And if I could get sucked into that, what's that going to be like for a 13-year-old who's trying to find their way in the world? And so right from the off, I thought, this social media thing there's some scary bits in this. And you have to remember back then, around 2011, 2012, we were still kind of romanticized about technology. People were talking about, oh my God, this thing called an iPod, and you can put 1,000 songs on it, and we don't ever have to have CDs again, and we can share pictures with people in Australia. And it was all this, everyone was just kind of had this kind of romanticized view about it. And I suppose at that time, I was probably seen as kind of a little bit hyperbolic, because I was going around going, hang on a second, guys, there's another side to this. So when I was trying to do a PhD, I remember kind of thinking about what I wanted to do that on. And my supervisor asked me, what's your core question? And I said, I really want to know why somebody takes a picture of a blueberry muffin and shares it with 600 people. Like, what is that about? And again, given the time, this was something new. And so I began my PhD journey looking at the psychodynamics of online sharing. So it was an early study into social media. And I was convinced that, there was something more at play here for us in terms of engaging with this technology. I've had a kind of thesis that it was something around recognition or validation, or something very kind of primitive within ourselves. And so I set up a Facebook page. I recruited 120 18 to 25-year-olds, and for 6 months I did an analysis of all of their sharing and all of their posts. And then I did an in-depth interview with the 6 most prolific sharers in that. And so I was looking at what was the motivation for sharing, what was the function of it for them, and what was their experience of it. And interestingly enough, these people who I spoke to, they weren't announcing themselves on social media. They were finding themselves. High levels of insecurity, a lot of concern around how others viewed them and saw them. And then that just started me on that journey that kind of, this is something deeper. There's something about our need to be looked at or looked out. If it indulge me for a second, there's a great psychoanalyst who says, when the baby is an infant, the mother holds the child with her gaze. So the eye contact is really important. And we use phrases like looked after, watched over. So this idea of being looked at can be very safe and containing, but it can also be very creepy as well. We can feel being looked at, even though there's no physical contact taking place. And so for me, the online world became this place where we could feel looked at and recognized and validated. and it was metricable. We could measure it, we could see the numbers. And so, yeah, I think our relationship with technology is far more deeper than perhaps we even realize. And so, yeah, so for the last, 13 years, I've tried to bang that drum to anyone who would listen. And back then when I was going around saying there's dangers here, I feel 13 years on quite vindicated, because we've seen the darker side of all of that now. And at that time, people would have said I would have been highly criticized as being hysterical and all of that sort of stuff. And I have similar feelings about AI. I have similar ideas that this is, without any safety guardrails in this is a kind of a wagon on the loose. And I think it has impacts on our emotional lives and our sense of ourselves. And I see a similar level of romanticism. Oh my God, look, I can get a PowerPoint and it can do this. And so we're really looking at, through romanticized glasses, about what it can do for us, without properly considering what it can do to us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, except I would say, add on to this the word anthropomorphizing, my favorite word, on top of everything else that the technology has been doing to our brain, as you said, for the past like 15 years, for the social media effect on kids specifically, and now we have AI in the game as well. We were already pretty much disconnected and lonely. And as of today, we see that this problem is as acute as ever. Nothing solved. That social media didn't solve anything. So what can parents, is there are a lot of concerned parents out there, and I as a parent and you as a parent, we obviously have seen or heard some stories about kids interacting with this technology and AI chatbots. And lately, there have been plenty of news out there about the suicides of the kids and teenagers interacting with AI chatbots. Um, is there something the parents can do, or what should they do if they want to, at least be aware of their kids' lives and what they do in terms of their interacting with technology? Because a lot of the times there's this human factor of, like, parents are usually not even, they don't even know about this technology enough to be concerned, I would say. That's
Yeah.
one of the reasons.
I mean, I think you have to take the position of being a critical friend of technology. Do you know what I mean? From the point of view of, and it is the critical view, like, technology hasn't delivered on its promise. If we go back to 2010, 2011, the promise was connecting people. That was the tagline around it. And while we have never had more connection within our virtual worlds, we've never felt more disconnected in our physical worlds. And so the idea of questioning the promise, of what is on offer, and almost thinking ahead to the consequences of that. So, the idea of, like, anxiety would have been predominantly the strongest, or the most kind of, I suppose, prolific of the referrals I would have gotten to my clinic for the last 10 years. It's anxiety. We were kind of developing an anxious culture. I would say in the last 2 to 3 years, that's changing, and it's loneliness. And it's, and I work with children under 12, I work with children 12 to 18, and I work with young adults 18 to 25. And I always say, look at the 18 to 25s, and it'll tell you where the 14 to 18-year-olds are heading. How can we almost look at this and see how we can reroute the next group? And if you look at the teenagers, you can look back to the under 12s and see where they're going. And it is that 18 to 25 group who have experienced a real sense of disconnection, a lack of opportunity to gather in spaces together. And I speak to these people, and these guys, maybe they're newly graduates, and they're they're working remotely and their college friends have moved on, and there's nowhere for them to meet and create connections and friends other than the online world. And they talk about the difficulties of the dating apps and all of those sorts of things, and the kind of, I suppose, richness of disconnect that's there. And there's lots of studies around this, that you can have all those connections in the world, but do you have anyone to call if you need someone to mind your cat? And it's that sort of connection that what's what was promised to us was not necessarily what's true. So for me, then, looking at the 18 or the 12 to 18 group, we need these kids to have an opportunity to gather. We need to compete with the technology, because I don't know what the situation is in Ireland, but for teenagers, if they're gathering in numbers, there's a kind of an assumption that they're up to no good, or maybe there's an antisocial component to that. So teenagers tell me, I don't like hanging out in public because the looks I get, or how that's viewed, or whatever that might be. I'm also interested in, and look, COVID had an impact on this too, because say, for example, the 15, 16-year-old boys, who are the ones I would really be worried about, they were the play date generation. So when they were, before COVID, their parents organized their social worlds. So they would say, okay, you can go to Tom's house and Tom can go to Paul's house and whatever. Then COVID happened. And then when they came out, they're 14, 15 years of age. So it's not cool to ask your mom or your dad to organize your social world, but they've never had the skill set to develop how to do that. And so their headsets and their gaming stuff is the only way in which they have learned how to socialize. And I see these boys all the time, and they say they have an appetite to connect. They really want to meet up, but they don't know how to say, do you want to come over to my house, or let's, and it's interesting. The tech world, I think, is designed in a way to keep us as virtually dependent as possible and as physically disconnected as possible. And if we were playing a video game back in the late 90s, whether it was on a Sega Mega Drive or something, we'd be playing it together. We'd have two joypads, and we'd be playing, and we'd be talking about what we're doing. If my son wants to play and he's 15 with his friends, they all have to go to their own homes, put on their headset and play. So it almost encourages that level of isolation, and I don't believe that's by accident. Do you know what I mean? I think because if you're playing together, or if you're hanging out, and we are seeing the first group of young people who didn't grow up on the street, on the road, or on the green, and there is a huge social cost to that. That's where we work out, conflict resolution. It's how we work out compromise. It's how we become autonomous decision makers, because we don't have adults to look to make those decisions for us. And I think we have already a group of young people who have subcontracted out decisions to other people. And I see AI as slotting into that now as being another avenue for them to outsource their questions to, or outsource their worries to. And it is phenomenal how many young people who I see are using platforms like ChatGPT for that purpose, to give emotional guidance, emotional advice, etc., etc. And so, getting back to your original question about what parents can do, it's almost about trying to be available for those questions as an option to your child. Be aware that the technology is perhaps encouraging them to spend less and less time together. And for those parents of those teenage boys and girls, it's really about offering opportunities for them to gather in person, being able to make up from the lost time, and not assuming that they can do it, because I think it's hard to assume that a 16-year-old wouldn't know how to organize their own social world, but we almost have to go back to the fundamentals of that and teach them how, because they basically were out that day when that was being taught, and so that gap is continuing for them. So as a parent, I'd be really critical of the technology in terms of what it offers. I would be trying to counter the isolation and disconnection narrative by trying to encourage young people to have space to be together, and almost giving them opportunities to practice that. And then obviously being very alert to who our children turn to for advice, and we, like, teenagers always turn to Google first. That was always the case, because it was easier than asking a friend or a parent, especially if you had a very intimate or a question that you were embarrassed about. ChatGPT and AI platforms have now, and there are others, so I'm just using that as a kind of an
Yeah.
example. They have become like a mirage in the desert for these kids, because now it gives me loads of advice, it gives me all this detail, it's all of that sort of stuff. However, there are massive shortcomings to that in terms of what advice it's giving you, and I don't know whether many young people have the critical skills to question that. It is because it's a generic piece of advice without any knowledge of your own personal circumstances. And I work as a therapist, and I can be open that people might say, "Are you just afraid that AI is taking your job?" I'm not concerned that AI is taking my job, because my job doesn't involve dishing out, best practice to everybody who comes into my room. It's about understanding the context of this young person's struggle, their history, their circumstances, and trying to fine tune a piece of an intervention that will help them to better understand themselves. And if therapy was just giving advice, that's what we would do. But it's a relationship, a relationship between two humans, which is very special. It's a real privilege to do that work, because of that the nature of that relationship is a very intimate one. But that can't be replicated with a software that is, well informed, not very well informed about you.
Yeah. And obviously, it's a very enticing thing for adults, obviously, when it comes to AI interactions, right? But kids, they're still developing mentally and physically, they're still growing. So if they don't know any better, they get used to those interactions when the psychophancy in those AI chatbots is really a thing, right? You can tune it
Yeah.
up and down as you want, but if you don't know any different, the kids are already growing up interacting with those chatbots. They've been only seeing this kind of one-sided interaction. So nobody's ever questioning you. You're always right. You're always the best, the smartest, stuff like
Mm.
that. They don't see, as you rightly mentioned, the real life, living in the real world and talking to real people. It's all about the good and the bad. But
Mm.
when you're talking to AI chatbot, it kind of just takes out this bad, so to just define bad, right? It's kind of those like embarrassing situations, how you navigate that, how you navigate arguments with your friends and family and kind of stuff like that. But AI takes it out of the equation entirely. And our kids, it looks like, are not all the kids, but some of the kids are vulnerable to this. They might grow up just totally lacking those skills of how you navigate those situations in your life,
Yeah.
which is kind of scary.
I mean, say for example, if you were coming to me for therapy, and you were just talking about a fallout, or an argument you're having with your friends, and you're telling me what happened. um I don't always say, "That's a great question, Elena. All your friends are bad people. You're the innocent victim here, and you should never speak to those friends again." Because that's not I'd be a pretty bad therapist if I did that. I would say, maybe this is a pattern of, this has happened a few times now. And can you think about something that you might have done to contribute to that? And can you own some of this? And so the process is oftentimes that being a good therapist is telling you what you need to hear rather than what you want to hear. And so,
Yeah.
but the AI chatbot's not going to tell you what you need to hear. It's going to tell you what you want to hear, because it wants you to come back the next time. And so, and I think there was something about ChatGPT had to remove something from their algorithm about giving people advice to break up from relationships, because it was telling everybody to break up from their relationships when they were coming with an issue. So the this isn't as sophisticated as we would think. But to get back to the idea of children learning, like, I've studied child development all my life, and children learn through repetition. They learn through error. They learn through a process. Like you won't remember every maths problem you ever did, but you might remember how you got to the answer because you repeated that, exercise in learning many, many times. But if we just provide the answer without the process, there can be no learning in that moment, from the point of view of, and we'll hear these kind of twee comments like life is a journey and not a destination. But with AI, we're just being brought to the destination all the time. It's almost like that process of trying to figure something out, trying to learn something, and trying to have an experience that leaves you with some learning from it. And learning about frustration, learning about tolerating boredom, learning about not having disappointment, learning about being wrong. These are crucial skills in our both cognitive and emotional and social world. We have to be able to know when we get things wrong. We have to know the limitations of our abilities sometimes, and we have to know that hard work might be. And so there's a very grave difference between gratification and fulfillment, and so from the point of view of much of the online world, it's very gratification focused. Press this, get that. Fulfillment is where you work at something over time, which creates meaning and purpose, which creates value. And so if we lose that level of investment in a process of meaning and purpose, then everything becomes quite disposable, even other people. And I'd really worry about how we are viewing each other as human beings. As the technology becomes more human, we risk becoming less human, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And in a way, coming back to how disconnected we were even before AI came along, right? We have not been just humans, just people in general on the internet. Uh, they are not engaging in, just deep and meaningful ways anymore. The short content is as short as it's ever been. The attention span is as short as it's ever been. So people that talk about instant gratification, right? You cannot hold the kid's attention today more than 5 seconds, right? So just everyone is watching shorts and everyone is engaging online, and this, the superfluous factor of this all, it just
Yeah.
makes me think, like, long term, the kids today, the way they are, what adults they're gonna be 10 years from now, and what they're gonna be teaching their kids, if they will be even able to, transfer some skills on them, if there will be even any skills to transfer, so to speak. I don't know, maybe I'm just over
No,
dramatizing
no,
everything.
no, you're not. I mean, again, I suppose if we think about it in terms of opportunity cost, right? So when we look at young people's use of the online world or social media, we shouldn't just be looking at what they're doing online, but we should also be looking at what they're not doing while they're online. Okay, so years ago there was a study that looked at, I think they were 5 to 9 year olds, and like a high percentage of those kids could search Google, they could watch a YouTube video, they could navigate the smart TV, whatever it was. But a high percentage of them also couldn't ride a bike or tie their shoelaces, right? So the life skills involved in, and there's really important life skills in terms of perseverance, toleration, being tolerant. If you're not used to having to wait, having to listen, like go back to the time when we would have gone to the video store to rent a movie and we brought it home and we rewound it and then we watched it, and you're kind of going 20 minutes in, this is a slow burner, but we'll stick with it. That's, you're learning skills of perseverance. Whereas now, if you don't like the theme tune to the credits, you can swap to something else and something else and something else. And what that's doing is it's having an evolutionary impact on our brains. Like, so from the point of view of, if I'd have told you in 2007 that in 18 years you would be doing most of your writing with your thumb, you would have been surprised. But that's a fact. Now we write mostly with our thumbs, not with our hands. And so these are kind of neural pathways. But if we think about almost like the time we've been on this earth as a face of a clock. Like, this technological evolution is tiny. It's 0.0000000 of a second in time. And in such a short time, it has changed absolutely everything, from the point of view of, there has been no weaning into this. There's been, like, I think it took Instagram 2 years to get 100 million followers. It took ChatGPT 2 months, so the escalation in this is phenomenal. And our brains and our minds and our emotional world are not wired to change at that speed. We need patience and time and process in order to engage. And so the evolutionary impact on all of us, in a way that, and we would see, from the point of view of, I would say, childhood is shrinking, because I've been working with children and young people since 1995, right? Back then, and even for many years afterwards, the onset of major disorders like eating disorders, self-harm, that sort of presentation would be around 14, 15 years of age. Now we're seeing the onset of that in 11 and 12-year-olds. So even in terms of the onset of those conditions are getting less and less and less. And that's because they're existing in a world that is expecting them to be older, younger. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, and again, we need to kind of take the telescope back a little and see the bigger picture here, because, and it's interesting, this is the first time that we've ever lived in a prefigurative society, which basically means it is the first time where the young are teaching the old, right? And so, say, for example, if you had the motor car, if you drove the motor car, then you're handing it down to your child, or when they're of age, you kind of say, don't speed, service it regularly, maintain it, don't drink alcohol and drive, and you give this advice with wisdom. Whereas with technology, it's been handed upwards. Do you know what I mean? And there is no wise voice in terms of this. It's just like, wow, look what this can do. And it's selling the kind of razzmatazz of it, which is like, if a teenager was sending the idea of a motor car to their dad, they could be saying, look, you can speed in it, and you can take corners this way, and you can pull the handbrake, all of those. So our relationship with technology isn't a mature one. It isn't a wise one. It's one that's quite immature. And so it always will take a while for us to reach a degree of maturity about it. You know what I mean? And I genuinely think, Elena, we will look back at this time when we gave children cell phones and say, you did what? You gave a kid of 12 years of age that portal to the outside. Almost like when we think about sending children up chimneys back in the day, we're going to look back and go, but the consensus of the given moment is that it seems normative to do that. But I think on reflection, we'll go, oh my gosh, what were we thinking? Do you know?
Yeah. I absolutely agree. And with the pace of everything that's been happening, and we are in this whirlwind of new updates and new models coming out, and everything, it's just new product gets dropped on us every single week. There's no time to get bored, to get even like wrap your head around what are you dealing with, right? It's always to the next something that's everybody's talking about.
Yeah, and I think
that's just, yeah, it can be really overwhelming. Again, as we're talking about kids, even for adults, it's really overwhelming. People are trying to catch up, just trying to kind of fit everything in their head. What is happening? What repercussions might I have from using that technology in the way that I use it, right? But talking about kids, it's just on a different level. And my question is, during our prep call, you also mentioned that the way AI can also discourage kids, and you talked about your daughter in terms of just their future or potential career that they might choose or what they're interested in. It kind of works that way as well. So if you want to just, elaborate on that a little.
Yeah, and again, that was a conversation I had with my daughter, who has always been really interested in animation and drawing, and she loves comics, and she has been drawing comic characters since she was tiny. But she always wanted to be an animator, And so we were having a conversation recently, and I asked her about that, and she said, "No, I'm not going to do that anymore because AI can do animation now. There's no need for us to do that." And I see that in other areas where maybe older teens and things who are looking at certain careers and thinking that's what I'd like to do, but will AI have taken that over? Will there be a place for that in the future? And for every human being who needs to do well in life and in the world and to feel good, we need meaning, we need purpose, we need to be seen, we need to be valued. And the last bit is we need to live in a place for a future that makes sense. We need to have a future that, not a future that we can predict, but one that makes sense. And I think many young people are living in a world where the future doesn't make sense. And the idea, and they're hearing these stories about how AI will wipe out all these different jobs and roles, and there won't be a place in the world for these things, which isn't helping them to have some focus or some kind of idea of a plan. So that obviously feels quite unnerving and unsettling in that respect. The other side of it is, and this is a more fundamental issue, is that I see young people not having a basis of faith or belief in the truth, right? So if you take that AI can now manipulate videos, and back before we would have said, well, a video is very concrete evidence that that's what happened, and we can use that.
Not anymore.
Yeah, not anymore. And so if you grow up in a world where you can't trust anything, then that's fundamental different. Like what looking at, even go back as Maslow's hierarchy of needs, to feel safe is the most fundamental and formative experience that children have. And I talk to parents all the time, and I say about make your child feel safe in your presence, make them feel safe to come to you with, and once you have that, all is good. But if from a global perspective, we don't feel safe in, and we rely on those kind of systems of government, police, the world, the leaders, to keep us with a sense of safety, that we are protected in some respects. But if we don't have trust in anything, then how does anything function? That's a really fundamental. And again, taking that into, say, for example, if you're in a relationship and you have an argument and your partner comes back and says this flawless apology that's like, I'm really sorry for what I said to you. I didn't take on your feelings and on board, and I realized the error of my ways, and I promise that'll never happen again. I've learned from it and everything else. Are you going to go, is that him or her, or is that ChatGPT that's giving me that answer? So which, obviously adds another layer of suspicion to something that was based on trust. And I used to talk about this years ago, that the idea of, in a workplace, if we had a conversation and I said, Elena, will you do this for me? And you said, of course I will, no problem, whatever. And then I go back to my office and I write you an email saying, further to our conversation in the hallway, you just said that you'd do that, which undermines the trust of colleagues. So now I have a kind of electronic paper trail, and now you're accountable, and which brings in that idea of questioning everyone and not trusting anyone. And I'm really concerned about what that means for a society and a culture if we don't have basic levels of mutual belief in each other's words, actions. You know what I mean? I think, and I don't know what that's going to bring with it, but my gut, my heart, and my head says it's not good.
Yeah, I mean, just the other day, my 10-year-old just kind of commented when we were talking, and he was on his iPad. He's like, Mom, you just can't believe anything anymore. A lot of the stuff is AI generated, so you can't really tell. So at this point, it kind of just doesn't really matter. To some point, when you're looking at things, at videos, and you start not even questioning, but at some point you won't react the same way. Just all your emotions. I mean, I'm talking about myself, but people might be different. Just from that perspective, if you're constantly in the background, you keeping that in mind, right? It might be fake, it might be fake. That's just you're not really gonna react at some point in time the same way. Your emotions and reactions to a certain thing that you see online will not be as genuine. Or you'll just be like, most likely it's fake, so I don't really want to waste my energy on this, right? Crying over, I don't know, an abandoned kitten somewhere. on an Instagram, and you realize a lot of the videos, like I sometimes just love going to some random Instagram accounts that would like post this AI slop uh, content, and a lot of the comments are just literally people believe those videos are real. But on the flip side, there are real videos of real people that putting their content out there, and some comments are like, "Oh no, that's AI generated." So it's kind of just dismissing this altogether.
Mm.
So it's like we're in this underworld where things are just flipped upside down or sideways, and you don't really know which way is up anymore. You can't
Yeah,
trust anything.
and if we go back to the example I gave earlier of the guy giving the apology to his partner, even if he did come up with that himself, there's going to be a suspicion that he got that from somewhere else. Do you know what I mean? So, but
Yeah.
the idea of not having faith and trust that what you see is real, like that's a fairly formative part of our development. That we see things, we touch things, we discover. Like the children are born into what's called discovery mode, right? So they're trying to understand the world, and when they're very small, they'll put things in their mouth and they'll taste them and they'll feel them and they'll touch them, and then as they get older, they ask lots of questions. So you typical 5-year-old who keeps saying why, and you have to keep you're very difficult to keep answering those questions. But then as they get older and they start to become very self-conscious and they're aware that they're being scrutinized by other people and they're being judged, they move from discovery mode into defensive mode. And defensive mode is very much, what will other people think? And so before agreeing to liking anything, you're kind of thinking, what's the consequence of me thinking this is good or this is bad? And so we become very concerned about the peer group and what labels we wear and what our clothes look like and all that sort of stuff. What we're finding is as soon as you introduce a child to a cell phone or a cell phone into a child's life or a smartphone, they flip from discovery mode into defensive mode. So you shorten that period of discovery. But now, even in discovery mode, you can pick something up, look at it, and still not know if it's real. Or you go through discovery mode believing everything is fake and nothing is real.
So the thing you discover, essentially the thing you discover is that nothing is real. So what's the point of discovery?
Exactly.
It's
and if we cease being curious, we have a big problem, because curiosity that's what breeds creativity. It's what breeds innovation. It's what keeps relationships going. Curiosity. The more you tell me about you and the more I tell you about me, then intimacy is developed through that process. Intimacy is the mutual disclosure of information between two people to a point where they get to know each other. But if we don't have belief in that information being real, or there's no value on that information, then where are the, and this is kind of a social glue that keeps societies together. Well, I know Elena and I know she wouldn't lie. That's a very protective and very scaffolding belief to hold for a friendship or a connection or a community. But if we have a place where nothing is real, nothing makes sense, and you can't believe anything, it develops such a cynicism and such a disposability of other human beings. And what I've been trying to advocate here locally in Ireland, and to anyone who listen, is that we need to go back to the village. We need to go back to being able to have real life communities, having spaces where we can gather, where we can be without the interference of technology, without the interference of, or the gaps or the spaces that are created in that. And I think that's for adults too. One of the things that it's a real bugbear of mine at the moment, I'm not sure if it's the same in the States, but we're seeing a lot of people, and really since COVID, kind of celebrating when plans are cancelled. Oh God, I don't have to go and meet my friends or whatever the case. And we're kind of selling the idea that being with other people is a chore and something we have to do. I really worry about that messaging being listened to by children and by teenagers, and by I can tell you that when I grew up in my life, in my home, we had visitors come to our home all the time. They came in, They called in on spec. Nobody knew they were coming, and they sat for hours, and we had conversations. Not always things that my parents would have delighted in, but it happened. I've been living in my house now for 2 years. I would say I could count on one hand the amount of visitors that have come to my home. You know what I mean? From the point of view of that. And if they're coming, they
Yeah.
have to give me a week's notice and tell me, because I can go upstairs and clean the back bathroom in case they go up there. And, we have formalized one of the most normal
Yeah.
human circumstances. And so the idea of not trusting anyone, but not feeling able to call into somebody for fear that you won't be welcomed, or that's a burden to somebody. And that's a really unfortunate turn of society that we have created. And I just would ask adults to be just mindful of that, celebrating the cancellation of plans and thinking about, because most of us who are doing that maybe have had those experiences of the social world and we have a good idea of the benefits and, of course, the drawbacks of it. But yeah, I just think for young people hearing that all the time, we're not selling the thing that they need the most, which is
And
do that.
I would also say, for adults and adults who are parents, it's about socializing with other people, but also socializing with your own kids. Because
Mm,
what parents forget, and forget all the time, that if you don't want your kids to be on their iPads, on the computer, on the phone all the time, you can take that away. But in that case, you'll have to talk to your own kids. You'll have
mm,
to do stuff with your kids. And when faced with that, a lot of parents are like, you know what, the iPad option was much better. It was very quiet. Case in point, me, sometimes when I'm just like, okay, and I have 3 kids, and it's a lot sometimes, it's a zoo.
mm,
But I'm like, okay, just put your iPads away, just play around, just do something.
mm,
And they almost destroy the house. And that's kind of a trade-off that you have to do. You have to do stuff with them. We're playing, we're doing things. It's either we're outside. I know that's valuable time versus just, you can't just take that stuff away from them, leave them in their room, and there's nothing, you
mm.
know?
Yeah, and I think that our concept of child safety has changed, over the last while, and again, the idea that if the child is up in their room on a device, they're safe, because we consider safety to be proximity rather than,
Yeah.
in actual fact, what's safe. And the idea of I was one of those latchkey kids. I went out on my BMX, my bike in the morning at 9 a.m. during the summer, and I came home when the street lights came on. And I would say I loved that experience. It was character building. It was brilliant. But I don't allow my own children that level of freedom at all. And
Yeah,
and
exactly.
and why do I not do that if I said it was so great? Well, back then I grew up in a village where I knew everybody and everybody knew me. So if I got into trouble, I was never more than 50 meters away from someone who could help. And if I was up to no good, my mother would know before I got home, from that perspective. But now I don't live in a world where everyone knows me or my kids. And so the village affords you that independence, from the point of view, we don't have that now. So now, without knowing the village around us or the community around us, we almost have to keep our children closer to us proximately. Do you know what I mean? But again, I go back to the idea that we are overprotecting our children in the real world, but underprotecting them in the online world. And it's almost like that image of somebody holding a child's hand crossing the road and then sending them upstairs to play a game that involves driving through the streets and running people over. It's the idea that we have a different sense of what physical and online safety is. And again, I think as parents, we need to, and again, I'm very slow to criticize parents because I think we are the group of first responders here. We're just trying to, it's whack-a-mole. Every time we get on top of something else, it pops up somewhere else. And it's a big ask. Nobody has done this before. Nobody has the cheat code to this. We are really working this out as we go. And we're learning from our mistakes in much of the time. And anyone who tells you they have the whole child online world stuff sorted, they don't. Nobody has that. But it's such a space of unknowns and guesswork. And I hope this works, or I'm doing this. And we're making so many of our parenting decisions with trepidation. We hand the child the phone. Nobody hands it going, you're finally of age. Here you go. We go bye-bye childhood. There's a kind of a sense that we do that, and knowing it's wrong, but needing to do it anyway. But I think in any of the conversations that we're having around these challenges, they all require collective action. It's really, really tough to do this on your own, and so from the point of view of I don't know, maybe if you're going to keep your kid away from technology and you're going to do that. If we were having this conversation 10 years ago, I would probably say, yeah, look, they'll be fine, because most people are saying everyone in my class has one, probably doesn't. However, the situation is different now. I'm not sure that when people say everyone in my class has one, they're not correct, from the point of view of we had figures in Ireland here last February that said, 87% of 9 to 12-year-olds have smartphones, and 27% of 6-year-olds have smartphones. And so,
Yeah.
Despite the messaging that we're really trying to get through, it's not the commercial messaging around that is really much, much more successful. And so the idea of collective action is really important. And I use the example of people coming together to try and create something like, and I'll use the example because sometimes I think people say it's too big, we won't have a chance with this. But if you think about leaded petrol, right? So years ago, you had leaded petrol and unleaded petrol, and now we don't have leaded petrol anywhere. It's all unleaded. And when you're asking how did that happen, or who took the lead out of petrol, it all started with a group of housewives in London who knew that the lead was damaging their children, and they participated and they petitioned, and first they were laughed at or sniffed at, and then they were listened to, and they started a movement which didn't say nobody can use petrol anymore. It just said, can we take the bad stuff out? And so from that perspective, it's an example of how change can happen. We can't just be resigned and say this is too big, none of us can do anything about it. But it does demand collective action, because I think it's very hard. It's very hard to solve a loneliness problem on your own. And this is the real challenge I have when I'm talking to those 22, 23-year-olds who are saying, I'm really lonely and I don't have anyone to connect with. I don't have ready-made answers to go here, go there, go there. And that bothers me, because I really want to be able to offer those solutions. But I think as a collective, we have a responsibility to offer them, or to put those in place for people. We used to have things here in Ireland called youth clubs, and they were kind of things where people would go after school or in the evening and just hang out. And it was like a few beanbags and a stereo, and people just hung out and did it. And they became very uncool over the years, and now they're something that maybe is frowned upon or something like that. But for me, that's a traditional solution to a contemporary problem. Almost, if we brought back the youth clubs, cool versions of those, but we would entice young people away from technology. I think we're not, like when you're saying to your kid, come off your phone, they'll say, to do what? And you go, tidy your room. That's not going to work, and it's like you said,
you're not selling it. You're not selling it.
No, and there's a labor involved. Buying a piece of technology for your child is like buying a puppy. The work is only starting then. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't. That's not the end of the process. That's the beginning of it. And so, and I understand people's frustration of having to compete with technology and compete with that high dopamine hitting, quick messaging, stimulating stuff. But we're undervaluing the value of the human connection. And even though children don't talk about that as something they value, if they experienced it, they would. I could say to you, I wouldn't like skiing, it's not for me, blah, blah, blah. But then I go and find out I really like it. We have to almost show children and young people what this is, to convince them it's something worth looking for.
A lot of the times you literally have to force your kids to come along. That's what I sometimes do, especially with my youngest 6-year-old. And I'm literally like, you're going with us, and you're gonna either like it or not, but you get to experience that where we're going. And guess what? Almost all of the times he's like, it's good that I went with you. I really liked where we went. It doesn't matter. It was like shopping for new furniture or doing stuff, just I want them to get out in the world and experience things. And in my view as a parent. I know I cannot protect them from every single thing, and there's online bullying and online grooming and everything else under the sun. As a parent, apart from the fact that I just lock them in the room with no technology at all and just a notepad and a pencil, right? That's just, there's no way I can protect them. But what I can do as a parent is I can help them develop critical thinking. I can help them be individuals with their own way of thinking, with their own mental core that no one else will be able to, kind of shake that easily. When a new friend comes along, they're like, okay, you're doing it wrong, or you're not cool, you're not this, not this. So they are able to respond. I know who I am, and I know what's right and what's wrong. So kind of for me, that's at least what I'm trying to do with my parenting. And you rightly meant, just rightly, you were like spot on when you said we are all winging it as parents as of today. That's what I constantly tell to my almost 12-year-old. I'm like, you are my first 12-year-old. I have no idea what I'm doing half of the time. Bear with me. So just we are growing into this as we go. So let's work together. But other than that, I really want to finish on some optimistic note. I'm not optimist by nature. I'm a cautious optimist. But is there something good about AI when it comes to kids and raising your kids and interactions with them? There has to be something beneficial.
There is,
Right.
and again, I would say it's not bad technology; it's bad usage. From the point of view of if you like, if AI will help children with dyslexia, and it'll help children with communication problems, and there's so much potential in there that for it to do good, that we need to almost encourage that and be really alive to that. But we also need to be alive to the risks, and if AI, we just don't let AI become the reason for why you have a child who's a beautiful musician who never strums a guitar, who's a wonderful poet who never scribbles a line, or a child who's a wonderful artist who never doodles. Do you know what I mean? Our job is to make sure they play the instrument, they doodle, and they write. And the best way in which you can do that is to approach your parenting with curiosity and empathy. Curiosity into their lives and their world and how they're experiencing it. And empathy is not about, that's rubbish, or what do you want about, that sort of judgment. And if you have empathy and curiosity, you'll be able to, and they'll listen to you when you show them how to play an instrument, how to draw a picture, and how to write a poem. Do you know what I mean? And so, despite all of the advances in technology, our relationship with our children is still the most influential one in their lives. But it is only influential if we choose to use it. It has never been harder to talk to our children because of the level of distraction, but it has never been more important to have those connections and conversations. So what I'd be saying to parents is, use the AI to complement your life, but just be careful it's not supplementing it,
Yeah, beautifully spoken. Thank you so much, Colman, for your time. And I know you have to go. I'm not going to keep you.
It's a real pleasure.
Yeah,
thank you so much.
It was likewise. It was a great conversation that was long overdue, I think, for everyone who is watching or listening us, and for me personally. Thank you so much, and I'll see everyone next time.
Thank you. Bye bye.